Ruthless train conductor humiliates an elderly guy. Then Morgan Freeman stands up and flips the odds. Rumbling ahead, the train sliced across the frigid nighttime air toward New York City. Inside the cabin, the low hum of people occupied the space. Business people busily hammering on laptops, student swipes across their phones, a mother softly cradling her sleeping child. Does power originate in compassion or authority? For charity, comment 1. For power, 0. Most saw it as simply another trip. Walter Harris was meant to be on a straightforward visit to see his granddaughter, Clara. Now, however, he was in the middle of the rouse, clutching his cane, staring directly forward from two keen, demanding eyes. And in front of him, arms folded, chin slanted in annoyance, stood Thomas Grayson, the train conductor who had recently decided Walter belonged nowhere. Walter pat his coat pockets once more, his heart pounding against his ribs. That ticket had to be present. He thought of purchasing it. He thought back on printing it. Still, it had vanished somehow, between getting on the train and settling into his seat. Travelers moved uneasily, some turned away, others watched with great curiosity. Thomas let out a big groan as though handling Walter was intolerable trouble. "Sir," he said again, his voice tight, "no ticket, no ride. It's that simple." Walter's hold strengthened around his cane's worn handle. "I paid for it," he stated in a firm but begging voice. "Could you have a look at the system? My name ought to show there." Thomas laughed quietly and shook his head. "Look, if you lost it, that's on you. Rules are rules. I have time to chase down missing tickets." Walter felt his gut turn over. This transcended a sheet of paper. This had to do with his dignity. And worse, this was happening in front of dozens of terrified or apathetic strangers too shy to speak up. From his seat, a middle-aged man in a neat blue suit looked up from his laptop and turned aside right away. A woman carrying a fancy purse changed her sunglasses, acting not to hear the conversation developing only a few feet away. Nobody spake in a word, since nobody wanted to participate. Walter inhaled deeply, willing himself to be cool. "Sir," he said once more, his voice much stiffer this time, "surely there's a way to verify—" Thomas had already turned his head and grabbed his radio. "I've got a passenger in car 3 without a ticket," he remarked squarely, addressing the onboard security of the train. "I'll have him dropped at the next stop." Walter turned over in his gut. His entire life, he had believed that rules were there to safeguard individuals rather than deny their dignity. And yet here he was, a guy who had paid his dues, worked hard, given decades to shape young brains, treated like a common thief over a misplaced piece of paper. Walter's head turned to show Clara. She was waiting for him at Penn Station, most likely bouncing on her heels with enthusiasm, clutching one of those small handcrafted signs with bright-colored markers. Should he never show up, what would she assume? Left alone at some strange rail station attempting to find his way home, he was not hugging her. Something lumpy developed in his throat. Once more, "Please," he pleaded, his voice softer now, nearly frantic. "I just need to get to my granddaughter." Thomas jerked his head and snorted. "Not my problem." Travelers moved once more. Some looked really uncomfortable now, as though they finally understood that this was shame rather than a little annoyance. Nonetheless, nobody raised a voice, till at last a voice broke through the heavy, strained air. Deep, leading, constantly. "Now, that's an interesting method of doing your work." Heads turned directly toward the speaker, and seated just a few rows away, Morgan Freeman dropped his coffee cup on the tray before him. Thomas's stance grew rigid. Recognizing the man who had just spoken, travelers started to whisper. Still, it was more than just Morgan Freeman's household reputation. He spoke in a cool, collected, planned manner as if he already knew exactly how this exchange would finish. Thomas cleaned his voice, then less confident of himself. "Mr. Freeman, that you were on board surprised me." Morgan gave a little but not friendly smile. "And that counts exactly for this." The inquiry hovered there, sharp and intentional. Blinking, Thomas looked for a response. He began to open his mouth, closed it once more at last, for he had nothing to say. Morgan looked at Walter, absorbing the way the old man stood there, clutching his cane, shoulders drooping, but yet clutching whatever dignity he had left. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," Morgan replied, his voice razor-sharp but silky. "This gentleman, who obviously paid for his trip, is being kicked off this train because of a lost ticket." Thomas shifted uneasily. "Sir, we have rules." "No," Morgan said, his voice strong but not loud. "What you have is the decision to do what's right or to enforce a rule." Right now, the whole train car was quiet. Once turned away, passengers were now watching and waiting. Even Sophia, the young train attendant next to the beverage cart, had paused midway through pour, her astonished eyes flickering between the two guys. Licking his lips, Thomas sought to manage the circumstances. I was just following usual process, sir." Morgan laughed softly, low and deliberate. "Standard procedure?" he asked again. Then he leaned forward slightly, dropping his voice such that every syllable landed like a hammer. "Tell me, Mr. Grayson, should this be your father, would you treat him the same way?" Thomas stood still, and immediately, nothing changed except everything. Thomas Grayson had spent years thinking authority granted him the right to choose who mattered. But today he was going to discover that actual power, it derives from respect. Including Morgan Freeman, he was about to ensure this course of instruction lasted a lifetime. Never this calm in the train cabin. The rhythmic clatter that had filled the air just seconds ago now seemed like a far-off background to something considerably more urgent as the wheels hummed over steel tracks. Every traveler was observing. Every set of eyes was riveted to the confrontation between an elderly guy clutching his cane, a nervous train conductor, and the unmistakable voice of Morgan Freeman, who had just changed the whole tone of the train with one statement. Thomas Grayson, who had spent years unquestioningly implementing train policies, suddenly found himself confronted with a force considerably more than rules and regulations, the unquestionably presence of truth and reason. And it took the form of a man whose words would have the entire globe listening. Thomas adjusted his weight uneasily, his typical assurance breaking under Morgan Freeman's stare. He was not used to interrogation. Not like this. "With all due respect," Thomas said, his voice stiff and defensive, "rules are rules. If we start making exceptions..." Morgan stopped him midway through a sentence by raising a hand. "Exception?" he said, his voice as smooth as it was strong. "Tell me something, Mr. Grayson. Do you consider kindness an exception?" When Thomas opened his mouth, nothing came out. Morgan's eyes were steady. "Because from where I'm sitting," he said, "this is about a man who paid for his journey in a system that has decided his dignity is less important than a missing piece of paper. This is not about rules." A wave of whispers swept among the travelers. Certain nodded. Some looked at one another, their expressions moving from passive onlookers to active players in this moment of truth. Even Sophia, the young train attendant who had stayed mute, now stood erect, as though anticipating what would come next. Still standing with his cane, Walter Harris glanced down and silently, frustratedly pressed his lips. Over a lifetime, he had been guiding young brains toward morality, decency, and the need of speaking out for others. And now he was learning from a course he had instructed countless times before. Thomas exhaled slowly, clutching his ticket scanner a little tighter as if it might somehow ground him in a scenario where he was rapidly losing control. He said gently, attempting to sound reasonable, "If I start making exceptions, where do we draw the line? If we let one person ride without proof, what stops the next person from claiming the same?" Morgan's facial expression stayed the same. "That's a great question," he responded, his voice bearing decades of knowledge. Then he leaned in just a little, lowering his voice just enough to land every sentence with intent. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Grayson. What would you do if your father were standing here in this exact spot?" The vocabulary strikes like a solid wall. The air grew denser. Thomas's throat started to dry out. Because in that one unquestionable moment of clarity, he understood the one thing he had been avoiding all this time. He was not merely staring at an old man without his ticket. He turned to face the father of someone. That of someone's granddad. Someone who has lived a life far longer, far more fully, far more valuable than any legislation could ever allow. Though the train moved softly over the rails, Thomas felt as though the ground under him was shifting. Previously quiet, indifferent onlookers, passengers were suddenly leaning in, waiting, expecting. Even those who had first turned aside Walter's suffering were now seeing him differently. He was no more merely a man battling a missing ticket. He represented something more, a test of morals, of character, of what it really meant to have power and utilize it sensibly. Thomas's teeth closed tightly. He never knew what to do at first. Morgan Freeman moved slowly forward, his presence occupying the area without even trying. His voice firm. "A man's worth," he remarked, "isn't measured by how much he owns or how well he keeps track of a train ticket." He stopped, let the words sink in. His treatment of those who can do nothing for him in return determines it. The comment landed with great weight. There were nods from the passengers. Sophia choked hard, her hands tightened into fists, as though she had been waiting her whole life for someone to utter those words aloud. Thomas curled his fingers on his ticket scanner. The air just waited for his choice. Furthermore, he came to see for the first time that the rules were not working for him. This time, that was totally under his control. He looked down at Walter, the elderly guy who had simply begged for an opportunity to see his granddaughter, who had been just courteous. Looking up at Clara's small, hopeful eyes, he silently begged her to do the right thing. He turned then back to Morgan Freeman, and at that instant he saw a guy who had perfected the art of wisdom rather than just a celebrity. A man giving him the opportunity to be better rather than direction. Thomas gasped sharply. Then at last he turned away. "I'll check the system," he said, his voice devoid of normal conceit. The tension melting just slightly, the train car breathed together. Sophia moved forward right away, using the passenger logs on her tablet. She nodded in a few short seconds. She exclaimed, "Found it," relief flooding her voice. "Walter Harris, paid in full. Seat 14C. There was a quiet gasp in the car. Walter's lips slightly opened as though he himself had forgotten he deserved this triumph. Clara tightened her hold on his hand and grinned broadly. "Thomas as well?" His shoulders slumped slightly, as though he had just discovered something much more than a customer service instruction. Knowing smiling, Morgan Freeman handed him one last one. "See, that was not so difficult, was it?" Thomas did not reply. But the reality? He understood that it was not. Thomas Grayson had always felt that power bestowed in him the right to set priorities. But now he was going to discover that real leadership, it comes from choosing humanity, not from policing laws. And Morgan Freeman? He was about to ensure this lesson would never be lost. For a long period, the only sound filling the car was the consistent rhythm of the train against the rails. Once lost in their own worlds, checking emails, surfing their phones, or casually chatting, passengers were now totally engaged in the sight before them. Once commanding the room with unflinching assurance, Thomas Grayson, the train conductor, suddenly stood still, his power fraying. Walter Harris slumped back in his seat across from him, gripping his cane with fingers slightly shaking, though no one could tell whether from age or from the weight of the occasion. His ticket turned out to be located. His payment was for his fare. Still, the moment lasted more than 1 minute, since Morgan Freeman wasn't yet done. Morgan looked at Thomas. His face was serene but unreadable. "Tell me, Mr. Grayson," he asked, his voice as soft as silk but as weighty as stone, "why did this have to happen at all?" Blinking, Thomas startled her. "What do you mean?" Morgan moved closer, his presence demanding but never oppressive. "I mean," he said, "why did this man have to stand in the middle of the aisle pleading for his dignity when all it took was a few seconds to look up his name?" A handful of the passengers moved in their chairs and exchanged subdued looks. Thomas started to swallow hard. I "I was following protocol," he continued, but his voice lacked the clarity it used to have. Morgan bent his head slightly to watch him. "And do you think human decency should come last in protocol?" Thomas began to open his mouth, then closed it. He had no reply for the first time. For the reality was, "Number not should." A whisper drifted across the vehicle. Some of the originally turned away, reluctant to get involved, now sat up straight. One man, a businessman in a smart suit, cleared his throat uneasily, as though he suddenly understood he had become complicit by silence. Sensing she wanted to grow her daughter to be someone who wouldn't turn away in a moment like this, a mother with a small toddler on her lap wrapped her arms around her daughter a little tighter. Inspired by what she had seen, even Sophia, the young train attendant who had been dubious earlier, suddenly stood higher. Thomas was no longer learning only this. Everybody has to learn from this. Thomas let out a leisurely breathed glance around at the eyes now fixated on him. For years, he thought his work was primarily related to control, about making sure the train ran without problems, that policies were followed, that interruptions were handled quickly. But he had learned something else today. This went beyond a ticket that vanished. This was about the person he had selected for a situation where compassion was a choice and he had selected the opposite. Now, too. He was paying the cost of that decision now. With tight throat, he turned back to Walter. With a softer voice now, "Mr. Harris," he murmured, I was wrong." Walter researched him for a protracted period. Then he nodded slowly. "Though change is better," he said, "apologies are nice." The words dropped with a weight that cannot be disregarded. Morgan grinned faintly. He said, "He's right, you know." Thomas inhaled a little, then, for the first time all day, he made the correct decision. Turning to Sophia, he continued, "From now on, if a passenger ever has trouble with their ticket, you check the system first. Always." Sophia's eyes grew wide, then she nodded, comfort and validation sweeping over her face. Morgan Freeman nodded slowly and favorably. "That," he advised, "is how you correct errors." A little voice broke the silence as the strain in the car started to relax. "Grandpa, look!" Everyone pivoted. 10-year-old granddaughter of Walter, Clara, had silently endured the ordeal and was clutching something small in her hands, a folded piece of paper. Walter's passport. It had stayed inside his coat pocket the whole time. The train car stopped momentarily in shocked quiet. A few laughs then started to sweep across the gathering, softening the atmosphere. Walter even gave a gentle, amused laugh. "Well, would you look at that?" he said quietly. Unaware of the irony of the occasion, Clara beamed up at him, delighted in her finding. Morgan laughed also, shook his head. "Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons, doesn't it?" he said, and for the first time that day, even Thomas cracked a little humbled smile. Morgan Freeman sat once more, grabbing his coffee as if this had all been another chat in his day, as the train headed toward New York. But he went back to Thomas one more last time before he did. "You see, Mr. Grayson," and he added, "respect is something you give because it's the right thing to do, not only to those who can demand it." Thomas nodded quietly. "I understood," he said. And this one time, he actually did. Walter leaned back into his seat, Clara still clutching his arm and grinning up at him. Arriving on this train, he had expected a straightforward trip. Rather, he had been obliged to fight for the very dignity he had spent his life imparting to others. Now, however, he could relax knowing that today he had won, and he hadn't simply benefited personally. He had won for everyone who had ever been written off, discounted, or made to feel little. Since today, kindness had paid off. Thomas Grayson had spent years thinking of rules as supposed to be followed without inquiry, but now he discovered that choosing compassion has more power than policy enforcement. Morgan Freeman as well? He took care to ensure the lesson would never be lost. The tension in the compartment started to relax as the train headed near its stop. Conversations started once more. The silence of motion once more permeated the room, and train life carried on. For Thomas Grayson, though, things would never exactly be the same. Having spent years enforcing regulations, he saw authority as essentially about control, about order, about making sure things worked smoothly. But today he had learned something far more. Authority meant nothing without humanity. He turned to Walter. His voice lacked the bravado it always possessed. Carefully he continued, "Mr. Harris, I hope you enjoy the rest of your trip." Ever the smart guy, Walter regarded him for a long period before nodding. "I think I will," he responded, his tone not hostile nor triumphant, just steady and knowledgeable, like a man who had seen the world change before and had hope that it might still change again. Still clinging to her grandfather's arm, Clara grinned at him. Walter to her was not only an elderly man riding a train, he was a man of heroes. Morgan Freeman stood, gently stretching, then turned to Thomas one more time as the train slowed for the next station. "You know," he added, "one day you're going to look back on this moment and realize it was bigger than a missing ticket." Thomas exhaled. "I already have." Morgan grinned, then looked to Walter and Clara. "Riding with you both was a pleasure," he replied friendlily. Walt nodded. "Likewise, Mr. Freeman." With that, Morgan got off the train and vanished into the busy station, leaving behind a lesson that would last well beyond the journey. This story helps us to understand that respect is a basic entitlement that ought to be given freely rather than something acquired by riches or position. Walter Harris arrived on that train anticipating only a quiet ride, but by the conclusion of the trip, he had reminded everyone on board that decency is a need rather than a privilege. Years of thinking that rules determined order, Thomas Grayson discovered today that real leadership is knowing when to put people before laws. Morgan Freeman argued not at all. He did not call out anyone. He just demonstrated to the world how much kindness, when given at the proper moment, can transform everything. Respect is not a luxury. Compassion is not a sign of weakness, and the strongest weapon a person may possess. It is the capacity to elevate others even in cases when one expects nothing in return.